So this week's video is pretty different for my channel. I believe it's a first on the channel, and honestly one of the first in my woodworking experience, and that is a project that's back in my shop because it actually failed at the customer's house. Now the problem for the failure, which I'll show in the video, is not necessarily totally 100% my fault, but part of the design I had contributed to the failure. So the old videos are on the channel. I've actually took them down because this customer contacted me at this point probably 2 months ago with the initial problem, and I didn't want anyone looking at the how-to videos with that issue. But now that I'm resolving it, I want to kind of tack this on to the end of that video so that people can still make the table, but the hardware has changed. So the problem I had was on the oak dining table that I made back in the end of September, beginning of October. And if you watch the channel, you'll remember I was concerned with that design because the tabletop itself did not have an overhang. Now, I told the customer the issues that could arise without having an overhang, mainly being that as the top shrinks, which it will because I made it at the end of summer, it would shrink in winter. You can't avoid that. That you would see it with the overhang, and she was fine with that. The other issue I had with it was because there was no overhang, the hardware design that I wanted to do, which is what I used to fix the table, I couldn't because you would see the cutouts on the aprons. I'm going to link in the description the video I kind of pulled that design from, and that is what I originally wanted to do, like I said, but I didn't. It's a great video. This hardware design is not my own. It's kind of the combination of two designs, so I'll put that in the description and you can check out that video. But basically what happened was not only did the top shrink, which I knew was going to happen, it also bowed substantially. So this is a part of the original top. It bowed so much I actually had to remake the top, and you could see it is lifted well over an inch. And by doing that, the hardware I had, in some parts the top actually started to crack. It was lifting so much the hardware wouldn't work because it was pulled and stressed tight. So the customer was very gracious with the fact that her table was bowing that much. The bowing of the wood is really something that was somewhat unavoidable. I'll discuss that in the video. I don't know if the lumber I got wasn't completely dry or what, but I've never seen a top shift this much before. But basically, like I said, once I got it back to my shop and looked at it, it had to be completely redesigned. I gave them two options. One option was to add an overhang, shrink the base, and add an overhang to the table so that I could use the original hardware design that I had saw. Or I told her I would remake the top out of plywood veneer, and then you wouldn't have to worry about it bowing and lifting. They chose to shrink the base, which is a little bit more involved, and add the hardware that will stick out the sides of the table. So that is what I did. This table, you could kind of probably see it in the video. Right now it's almost done being fixed. I'm not going to show putting stain or finish on it because, like I said, I'm tacking this onto the original series. So none of that will change. Fitting the leaf and all that will still stay the same. It's mainly the extension hardware I used, the design of that has changed. So I'm not going to lie, this is a little bit of a bruise to the ego. It happens. I highly doubt there's any woodworker out there that has never experienced some sort of furniture failure. I'm a little satisfied with the fact that I don't think it was completely 100% my fault. But if you watch these videos, you know that I stand by what I make. And even though I took a pretty large hit on this, especially remaking the tabletop, because I'm obviously not charging the customer for this, it wasn't really their fault. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, the redesign. Cutting down the base was a pain, but all that's done with now, and she should be getting her table back soon. So I'm attaching the two original pictures the customer sent me. I think there are a variety of issues that cause this problem. Number one, the design. Tabletops are going to move and shift and shrink. The overhang hides a lot of that movement. Number two, I think routing that groove down the center and then gluing in a piece perpendicular to that had an effect on how it was shifting and moving. But I think one of the biggest issues, and the customer agreed with this as well, is when I was building this table, it was extremely rainy for about a week, and I think I built it when it was full of moisture, and then when it shrunk back down to size, it was somewhat catastrophic. So you could see with it unattached just how much it bowed. When I got it back to my shop was when I realized it was not worth saving. You could cut this up into smaller pieces, flip them upside down and all of that, but it just wasn't worth it to spend the time doing that. It could be quite a process, but you could see just how much that top has lifted, looking at it from the edge as well. So what I had to do to cut down the base was pretty much take the entire thing apart. The one plus side to this was I had already done it before, so I knew how to build it. A lot of my process involves problem solving. All of that was already done, and I could use a lot of my old marks. I had some of the old scrap pieces laying around, so it was easy to duplicate those parts. In general, because a lot of this material is already in the original series and I'm planning on just making this a part, I believe it's going to be part 4 of that series, I'm going to go through a lot of this fairly quickly. But I basically cut out those pieces that are dovetailed in place, and I'm only removing a couple inches from this, just enough to give me about an inch overhang on all of my sides. So I took all of my aprons and cut them down. It's getting shrunk in the length as well as the width, so you can see just how much I'm taking off. Then I had to go through and redo those stub tenons on all the edges. This was pretty easy. I used the one edge that was still intact, and I could just use that to set up my stop as well as set the depth of the blade for the cut and just recreate those stub tenons. These were pretty easy to make the first time around, and they were easy to make the second time around with the measurements already there. Then and you're going to see what happens if you pull a radial arm saw too fast with a dado stack in. It wants to catch. That's one of the most dangerous parts of these saws is they do tend to catch like that. But I went through and I'm going to recut those dovetails because obviously their placement has shifted, and I used the dado stack because someone in the original video series recommended removing the bulk of the material before cutting the dovetails, and it was a great suggestion and it made cutting them much easier. So then I could go through and once again with the original marks I could cut the angled 1/2 inch groove down the side, which is how I'm attaching the corners on this. The one nice thing about this table is it turned out really sturdy, and it was still sturdy at the customer's house, so I didn't necessarily change that part of the design. And those are the new corner pieces. Obviously cutting down those aprons meant I had to replace those as well. And then I could just, this is remaking the corners. This was a pretty simple process. It's a groove, and like I'm going to say throughout this video, I just used the old measurements from the old pieces I was able to salvage. I could remove that excess, clean up the corner so it slides in nicely, and then these are my corners. These stayed the same size. And then I could just slide this into place, and it was pretty simple because you could see where the center is for those threaded inserts in the legs, and I went down an inch from the top and up from an inch from the bottom, so it was really easy to re-drill those screws and then attach all these pieces. So this material is a little bit thicker than the original, so it looks like there's gaps on all the edges, but it's really not. It's just thicker material. And this is just re-drilling those holes. So unfortunately, in order to shrink the base, with the way I built it, in order to shrink the base by just an inch in each dimension, I really had to rebuild the entire thing except for the legs. So then to redo the dovetails, I remade the jig I had, which is perfectly spaced to accept a bushing with a dovetail bit in my router. This was only unfortunate because the day after I did this, I actually found the original jig, which would have been helpful. I thought I threw it away, but it was kind of hidden in my shop. So you can see I can line that up and just attach it to the top, because you'll never see these screw holes. And then with that material already removed from the dado stack, this was a very simple cut. I didn't have to redo all of these. I believe 2 of them were still in the proper places, but in order to have the placement accurate, I did have to recut a couple of these. So you'll see the originals are still there, but the dovetail is still embedded in it, because all I did was saw it off. And then I can recreate the dovetails. Once again, I used all of the measurements from the original, so this process was much faster. A lot of times setting up the tools, that's when my camera fell over, setting up the tools and doing test pieces is the longest part of the process. So with some of the scrap I already had, it was easy to redo. And then those dovetail pieces slide into place. This is just a couple photos of the top. You can see with it off the table just how much it bowed, and it just wasn't worth it to salvage. It was over 1 inch. So with it bowing this much, the sliding dovetails I had in place, they just couldn't function. I was actually pretty fortunate that she discovered the tabletop bowing before they had another holiday, because if they went to go open the table, it wouldn't open. So then to start the sliding mechanism, I'm using poplar. I like poplar because I could get it at Lowe's already dimensioned, which saves me some time. And it's a fairly stable material. After all these issues with wood movement, I wanted something that wasn't potentially going to move around a ton on me. And I'm just routing out a groove. Now this part of the design I saw on Fine Woodworking. There's an article, which I'm not going to link in the description, because I probably will, but you usually have to have a subscription to read those articles. So if you want to read it, you'll have to pay for it. They have a guy on there who makes his own extension slides, and he uses them with draw slides. Now he builds really bulky ones because you're splitting the aprons and opening the table, but I combined that design with the design in the video from Guy's Woodshop in order to get the what I needed. One of the reasons I sunk them is, you could see, if you don't, you have to cut out about a 2-inch space. If you sink them, it's only about 1.5 inches, and now your slide is going to be resting on a wooden base. You don't have to worry about it, all the weight of the tabletop resting on the slide. So then I went through for my edges and I made my marks for the first grooves. I don't have the dovetails glued up in place yet, because if these slides aren't perfectly parallel, they will not work. So I didn't want to glue the dovetails up until I knew it was going to work, and I can make adjustments if they still weren't glued. So on the first cuts of these, I crept up on it. After a while, that got really old, and I just sent it through all at once. You could see I have a piece of scrap attached to the miter gauge, so you don't have a lot of blowout on the back side. The one thing I will say about this table, it has a Waterlox finish on it, and I really like water blocks. It's a durable finish, but having this thing around my shop and banging it around, I'm pleasantly surprised with how durable that finish is. So then once I had those back ones done, I could do, I can measure off from the edge the same amount and then do the dovetail ones as well. So all of these should be the same size. It's really important that these are parallel and square, or like I said, they will not open. And then I kept these long. In the video I saw, I believe he cuts them up. I just kept them long to make life a little easier. And then I'm eventually going to glue these into place, but to hold them for now, because I'm testing everything, I just put some screws in there, and then I can mount my slides. So the slides, I have them extended about the height, the amount I want, and I mounted them pretty much in the middle. These are full extension slides, and I got long ones, so I had plenty of room to work with, and I can move them back and forth if I needed to, but this placement ended up working out. So then for the part that's actually going to slide out, I used the same material, but I took about 1/16 of an inch off either side. Once again, I don't want this to start binding down the road, and it was a little bit long for my opening, so I ended up routing out a groove, and this was kind of a pleasant mistake because it ends up making a perfect stop for the table, so that you don't have to worry about opening it up too much. You can see they stop almost at about 10 inches. It's an 18-inch leaf, so it only needs to open up 9 inches on either side in order to fit it in there. The table itself is really long, which is one of the reasons I never wanted to split the apron, because it's already quite a large table and it would definitely sag over time. And then I just marked those while they were in place, and I can mark the receiving end of the table slides in there. I use the elongated vertical holes, and there's going to be adjustments with these, moving them up and down. And then I counterbored some holes in there so that shorter screws would screw into the top. And then after I counterbored those holes, I used a bigger drill bit to drill through to the top side, so that if this table does move, and it most likely will, the top can shift a little bit in these holes and not crack. And then this is what they look like put together. Like I said, there is some fine tuning on this. I'm still kind of messing around with the table, but the basic gist of this project, I was really happy with how these worked. And then this is it mounted in the table. You can see just how nicely they slide. And the nice thing about most of these parts being metal is they won't shrink and move like wood will. Now for the top, I did something I usually don't do. I bought all the lumber on Woodcrafter Source. It's a lot more expensive to do that, but it already came surfaced on 3 sides. You can see all I have to do is rip one edge clean. For a special request, I believe it was like $30. They'll give you almost the exact dimensions of lumber you needed. The main problem with this project was just that I have a very tight schedule, and now you're adding almost 2 weeks of extra work onto a very tight schedule. So in order to save time, I just bit the bullet. I ate the cost of the lumber, and this made my life so much easier. I was able to get it and glue up. I let it set in my shop for a little bit to acclimate, then I was able to glue up the top pretty quickly. It's also a great source for people that don't have a planer or a jointer. You can buy lumber and still make furniture without those tools. It is a little more expensive, but I don't think it's a terrible deal. And then you could see I test fit those pieces in there. I made sure both sides worked. And then once they slid nicely, that told me that everything was square. Those slides were perpendicular and worked perfectly, and then I could glue in my dovetail pieces. Now I was using the hardware that came with the slides, like in the video I'm attaching in the description. I'll eventually switch those out with bolts and whatnot, but I'm not permanently gluing these slides in until the project's almost finished. So you can see what they look like in place. And then this is with bolt tops on. You can see the top has to be fitted. I still have to clean up that center seam, and that one piece is lifting a little bit, but it slides much easier than the other one, and that is the basic fix.